Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we gather together today on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our Indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Okay, thank you all for being here today. This is our penultimate panel discussion for the speaker series this quarter. Next week, we are going to have a group of students, graduate students from environmental studies, sharing their research topics with you, and that will be our last formal presentation. So we have a really full set of ideas on this panel, so we're just going to jump right in. I introduce these folks. We're going to talk today about food systems and uncertainty, and I know that this is something many of you are thinking about, maybe because you're going to the grocery store and things are costing a bit more, or you're hearing the impact of climate change on agriculture and food systems. And so we want to just spend a little bit of time exploring what's happening at various different scales. So some quick introductions. So Piper McIntyre is to my left. Is the microphone sounding weird to you all, or is it good? Okay. Piper McIntyre is to my left. Piper is a student at Fairhaven College, concentrating on botany and holistic food systems. Piper's main areas of study are biology, sustainable agriculture practices, and agricultural policy. Piper is especially interested in small-scale food systems and adapting food systems to the warming climate. Right. And then we have Peter Gagan, who is a PhD candidate in ecology at UC Davis, but now living in Bellingham. Who is researching the effects of agroecological processes or practices on soil ecosystems and yields in California's Central Valley processing tomato rotations. He's been active in farming for over a decade, most recently as a co-manager of Seeds of Solidarity, which I think you're going to talk about later, mutual aid farm in West Sacramento, as the coordinator for the Ferndale Food Bank Garden. And then on the end, Professor Zoe Plakias is a Western alumna from 10 and an associate professor of economics. She has a PhD in agricultural and resource economics from UC Davis and teaches classes and conducts research on a variety of issues related to food, agriculture, and the environment. So thank you all for being here today. I gave them kind of two sets of prompts, and the first set of prompts was about characterizing what in the world is going on with food systems right now. So if we want to call it a problem, we can call it a problem. There are some problems and issues. So I asked them to share a little bit more about the state of food systems, what's concerning, and what are some of the uncertainties that they see about food production and agriculture. So we're going to start with Piper.
Awesome, thank you. Still a student. I haven't spent a lot of time working in food systems, but I've made observations and I've spent a lot of time studying. I'm sure that there's a statistic about food insecurity and Washington State college campuses. Approximately 40% of students are food insecure. So that could be 40% of the people in this room. It's affecting like us and our peers in a really significant way. So that's something I notice day to day. And I feel like most people's concern at this stage is affordability. I was talking to people and letting them know I was going to be speaking on this panel, and almost everyone was just, my main concern is that I can't afford food. It's issues with supply chains, with climate change. Food is becoming more difficult to produce and get to the places it needs to be, and it's making costs rise. And with corporate price gouging, people just are unable to afford their food. And I think also a big thing that I notice as a student who's studying food systems and agriculture, a lot of people will tell me, oh, I wish I could study what you're studying, but no money. And so I think there's a big group of people who to do food systems work, but feel like it's not something they can or should be spending their time doing because they're concerned about money. And I know that the average age of the farmer is getting older and older. People tiring. There are fewer and fewer young farmers, and I think people feel really out of control of their food. And I think here on the college campus, a lot of people are living on their own for the first time and are running out of meal plans and feel really, really disconnected and disillusioned with the meal plans and have a lot of trouble affording or accessing anything outside of that. So if the meal plan isn't, you don't really have an option. If you don't have a car, you don't have a car, you're going to Winco. So you're kind of stuck here. You can feel really isolated. So I think the disconnect is something I really see, but I do see a lot of people who have a really strong desire to connect and maybe feel just boxed out cost wise. So I do think I see a lot of people who have good things in their heart, and want to work in food systems and want this to be a good thing, but affordability, I think, is the main concern that I have on the student level.
Thanks, Piper. Something you just said about working in food systems is when I was in my mid-20s, I was working on farms and was kind of at this crossroads of like, well, I could go and lease land for, maybe a year or two, see how that goes and, maybe financially break even. But at that point, it was like I just couldn't see a pathway towards that. And I think those are some of the things that people face, in trying to decide, like, how do they become part of these solutions? And yeah, I think the average age of farmers now is 60. And when I started farming in 2012, I think it was 56 or 57. So that gives you some idea of the trajectory we're moving in. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter. So as Professor Darby, do you go by Kate? Okay. As Kate mentioned, I'm a student at UC Davis in ecology grad group. I mainly focus on soil ecology and annual cropping rotation. So I think quite a lot about soil degradation, land uses, some other concepts in ecology like patch dynamics on a landscape, and for instance, how decisions by farmers, on that landscape may impact things at a higher level. My current work really focuses on some of these agroecological transitions. So this is similar to things like organic or regenerative, but I frame everything as an agroecologist in these larger transformations, which are really a 5-level process by which you transform a food system. And so the first is really these big conventional farms in the Central Valley where I work. They are fully industrial, all kinds of chemical inputs, highly dependent on multinational corporations in order to exist and in order to produce food. They produce tons of food, but it is starting to get to a point where it's getting precarious because California is running out of water. So moving on from that paradigm at level 1, they could potentially be implementing some kinds of practices that reduce their impact on the environment. They're not necessarily changing anything, but they're looking to become more efficient. So I've done some research on that in rice in California. And then currently my work is at the level 2 transition where you start implementing some ecological practices into those systems. So that could be cover crops, that could be compost, that could be reduced tillage. Those are kind of the low-hanging fruits, so to speak. And then some of the people that I work with, though not many, I would kind of argue are not quite there yet, are at level 3, where you have a full systems redesign. You start really getting to a point whereby you're not so much reliant on the inputs, but you're now creating ecological processes that could allow for that system to self-regulate and internally regulate. And so things like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus cycling are all much higher levels in that system and better well regulated, so you're not losing a lot to the environment and flushing into waterways and things like that, or off gassing into the environment. And you're potentially also sequestering carbon in the soil. So I kind of think a lot about that, but I also in my personal life, and this is sort of the practitioner part of the agroecologist, is I do still farm, but it's on a much smaller scale than when I started. So I've been involved in urban farming for about a decade, most recently in West Sacramento. at Seeds of Solidarity, which is the mutual aid farm for NorCal Resist, which is a large mutual aid organization in Northern California, mainly in Sacramento and the Bay Area, and focused initially on immigrant issues in 2016 as a result of the Trump administration, and coming in and starting what we've all seen now over the past almost, it's been a decade. So we focused quite a lot on that, but we also have a lot of other programs like food production, and really trying to kind of recommon public spaces through urban farms, and also to provide a connection for people who, like Piper talked about, don't necessarily have access or control over what they might be able to get access to. And so trying to recreate or to create food sovereignty. And that's really when a community has direct connections to their food system, and they can influence like how food is grown and what they would like to see grown. So I kind of think at this like big ecological scale, but then also at these really small micro scales, now a 1/10 of an acre at the Ferndale First Fruits Garden. So happy to answer questions about that, and I'll pass it off to Zoe.
Okay, awesome. I've been scribbling notes because it's always, you hear people say things and you always have additional thoughts that come from that. I will try to keep my hand the same distance from my face the whole time. We'll see how that works. Okay, so a couple of things that came up. I'm Zoe. It's lovely to be here, by the way. So here on campus, I teach some classes related to food. I teach that economics of eating, which is a 100 level economics class, and population and environmental culture, which is a 300 level economics class. So if you're interested at all, come see me, and we can chat. So a couple of things. First, what Piper said about affordability. I mean, affordability is a concern everywhere. Talking about the U.S., what's happened is there was a period, I don't know if you remember, a year or two ago, where everyone was really mad at economists, which is a common thing that happens. And part of what the issue is that economists were saying, well, inflation is moderating, like inflation is going down. And people said, well, I'm still paying an arm and a leg at the grocery store. And we're right. People rightly were frustrated with what economists were saying, I think, because what had happened is we've seen this just huge like increases in prices throughout COVID. And so although the rate of growth had eased a little bit, it was on top, those rates of growth were on top of huge increases in prices that we saw during COVID and have just been sustained. So I still get shocked when I go and I pick out yogurt at the grocery store and it's $8 instead of what I used to pay, right? Which I don't remember anymore, but it was a lot less. And so that that price is impacting all of us. It's also, around seeing increases in food insecurity as well. And so food insecurity can be both a cause and kind of an outcome of conflict. And so we kind of see that connected to conflict around the world as well. A couple of things kind of thinking about the state of food and agriculture that I want to mention. Another piece is climate change, of course. And I think one of the particular issues with climate change is that it makes, farmers have unique localized knowledge to their climate. And as climates change, it means that farmers have to change. And we can talk, when we start talking about, so we can address this, I can talk about this more. Part of, I think, the challenge that needs to be addressed is how do you share that knowledge and across, farmers from different climates who might need to learn to grow different crops or grow things in a different way. And so that's a challenge within the food system. And there are certain places, of course, that will just become non-arable land, but there's also just a lot of transitions and transformations that have to occur, right, to deal with climate change. Another big thing right now that I think is characterizing our food system is geopolitical uncertainty. We are faced with this nationally, we're faced with this internationally. There's been a lot of kind of atomization that has occurred, and the United States has had a hand in making this occur. So meaning that countries are becoming less connected to one another. And this kind of deglobalization on the one hand, you might say, well, okay, well, that could cause some some positive kind of focus at the local level. At the same time, that lack of interconnectedness can create additional kind of geopolitical precariousness. If we're not as interconnected, then we might likely to be in conflict with each other. And I think we are daily watching the news and scared for what we're going to see when we open the app or look at the newspaper, if that's the thing that people do. And see that uncertainty. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop here, is I wanted to note that I think we're hearing about the different scales, and people are talking about scales. And in economics, we talk about about economies of scale and about the benefits that you can get when you do scale up. And I think that that's been such the name of the game in agriculture for the 20th century. We saw an increase in scale in the United States and around the world. One of the things that's come from that is that not only have we had social costs that have come from that and environmental costs and what we call externalities in economics, so external costs that companies don't have to pay, but so you have had can't read my own notes. Become disconnected from food, and with that scale, I think there's a lack of trust and accountability, and that's a problem that it kind of creates challenges within our food system. And the very last thing that's part of that I'll say is that a lot of the food produced in the world is actually produced on small farms. The U.S. It's a little bit different, but most of the people are still small farmers. And I think there's an interesting challenge that we have as we think about the culture and food system, to think about how do we help the people that want to farm, and how do we help the people that don't want to farm not farm? Because there's a group of people in the world that has lived on the farm to a city, or may want to change their life in a different way. And they are currently not able to do that because they're in a poverty trap where they are, right? And so it's interesting to kind of see that going in both directions, depending on what geography you're looking in and what the conditions are. So thanks. I'll leave it there.
I want to spend just a couple more minutes, if it's okay with you all, like characterizing what's going on a little bit. And the things that I noticed is, we all know these issues are interconnected, right? So your concerns, Piper, about affordability in the college food among college students is connected to these geopolitical phenomenon. But I'm wondering if we could tease that out a little bit. Anyone has anything to add about how the experiences, probably most of the folks in this room and logging on are not food producers, right? But we all eat, I hope. And how is that connected to all these other things happening in the fields at the global level?
Go ahead, you start. Yeah. If you want to do that. Be ready. So.
Yeah, I think just kind of talking about it from the farm scale, it's this weird situation that we're in now, and I don't want to overstep my bounds with an economist to the left of me, but it is this really strange situation whereby we have a global economic system, and then all of a sudden we have this like hard stop protectionism that the Trump administration is like putting forth, and so you're really pumping the brakes on, I don't necessarily agree with the way that the global food system is constructed, much as the way I didn't necessarily agree with, some of the ways in which we worked with the rest of the world, like with USAID, but I think taking those programs away was absolutely devastating. And the same could be said for the way that the economic system is in play. You can't just just totally pump the brakes and expect that you won't have this cascading effect, whereby you have crops sitting in fields in Iowa because China's no longer buying soybeans. And so you're completely wasting resources and honestly ingenuity and a lot of knowledge that farmers have to overcome some of the challenges that they already face. They don't need to be facing issues of whether or not next year they're going to be viable because the Trump administration has decided that they're going to put 100% tariff on China and expect that those soybeans are going to be sold to China. And so these impacts are global, but they hit everybody, starting with the food producers who have to make these big decisions who are also, tied to these production paradigms that they're locked into. And so I'm talking about the big scale, right, at like the Midwest or California. A lot of food is produced, and a lot of these farmers are locked into these $250,000 tractors that have GPS tracking on them. They're tied to that silo that they spent, who knows, $500,000 putting up, or trying to worry about where their workers are going to be next week because ice is out, and things like that. And so there are myriad issues facing the producer. And it's, I won't get into what that does to prices, but you can only imagine like how much that is exacerbating the problems that people are already facing, like Piper and Zoe both talked about.
Do you want to go next, Piper?
Sure.
Okay.
Something that this made me think about is last year I went and visited Mexico, and I visited with River, and we visited this big cauliflower farm. And I remember it was during a time when the Trump administration had placed tariffs on Mexico. And we were like, what do you think about that? And like basically to go around the US now. We'd rather deal with Canada. We don't want to deal with the US anymore. And so I think it was interesting to see that, like, because the US is attempting to isolate itself in the global market, they're facing these consequences, and that, like, we can feel it on this level. And I also spent a couple of years living in Canada, and we in a really like unique location to be so close to the border and yet so far from this other country. Like, politics and culture diffuses down here, and especially when Trump got elected the second time, all of my friends were like, I'm never seeing you again. I don't ever want to visit the US ever again. So I'm like, I don't know if I have a lot of thoughts on how that's affecting us here on the college campus, but it's definitely something I've noticed that, like, we're getting left behind because of these large scale decisions that are going on. And it was a big decision of mine to come back to the US because I was like, they're doing great work in Canada, college campuses, addressing food insecurity, and they're able to make big policy moves that we've been not able to do in the United States just because of against. So it's been really interesting to see in the last couple of years, and I think that we can a lot from looking to other countries, and like Canada is just right there, and we are so similar to them, and we can learn. But they don't have what to do with us right now. So yeah.
These are fabulous comments. I agree with everything that's been said. A couple other just things to add. So much of the policy that the U.S. policy right now is harmful to U.S. consumers, to U.S. farmers, and to others around the world. I mean, the USAID closure. Just had a visiting speaker during my class from Guatemala City, just talking about how the aid world is being impacted by that closure. And the people I know that work for USAID are probably the biggest critics of USAID, but they were in it to help make it better. There is no economic rationale for the tariffs. So I'll just say that as an economist, I think you'll get 99% agreement from economists on that. There are a few other people with economics degrees in the room, so you can totally disagree. This is impacting fuel and fertilizer prices, of course, and food is transported, right, at all different, the tomatoes are transported from the farm, but first there's the fossil fuel used in the fields, right, in tractors and all of the machinery that is primarily fossil fuel based at this point. There's every truck, every boat, right, they're all being impacted by these fuel price increases, which directly impacts the price of food. fertilizer prices are increasing, and that is impacting the price of conventional crops and around the world. And I think also just thinking about the human impact, I want to note that there's like the stress and anxiety that come from this that impact everybody, and that impacts, I mean, this like that's people who are already most vulnerable, right, are at most risk of being like impacted in a devastating way. I also want to mention we haven't talked about social safety net in the U.S. yet, but there were policy changes through the bill last year, big bogus bill, whatever we're calling it, that created SNAP work requirements, and we've seen SNAP. I mean, SNAP enrollment has declined precipitously across the U.S. And there's been an uptick, I think, in I think we were chatting yesterday, and maybe Kate, you were talking about how there'd been an uptick in demand for charitable food. So going to food banks, right? If you can't get food through the SNAP program, and so that is also impacting people right at the time when they would need it most, right? And so that's that social safety net is there to help people when there's an acute crisis or you know, other kind of crisis situation, and that's just that bottom is falling out as well. And I just want to, when there was also a government closure last fall, I was thinking about what was happening on campus here. So the Basic Needs Office was working to provide gift cards to people who SNAP recipients who are students to try to cover the costs of food during that time. So there's some, you know, amazing mutual aid type and kind of scrappy activities that are happening. But we're seeing really a perfect storm that's impacting these global events, and these things that are happening at the national level have direct impacts on which is all of us. So.
Yeah.
Like, I remembered a couple more things that frustrate me about this university. There's so there's the Outback Farm at Fairhaven, and pretty much every year its funding is threatened, which is really frustrating to me. It's one of the only spaces on campus that we spend time learning about agriculture practices, and every year it has to fight to justify its existence. And another thing that I noticed when I transferred here is that there is no self-governance over our food system. So Chartwell's is the contracted food provider for this university. I got here after the switch from Aramark, so I never got to see all of that. But cities have a lot of self-governance where they can decide what producers and what like establishments and storefronts get to pop up on their campuses. And in a lot of those spaces, they're also able to open like mutual aid cafes that are volunteer run by students and are able to provide free food. Has self-governance, and they have their own like, mutual aid-based cafe. UBC has 2 mutual aid-based cafes that run on volunteer leave and are able to provide free meals. And if we were to be interested in opening something like that here, it would be an absolute bureaucratic nightmare because of Chartwell and like because we are not a university with self-governing food systems. So it's something I'm like, it'd be so great if we could open something like that.
That's a really great segue. You know, folks who've had me in class have heard me say some version of the fact that as academics, we're really good at tearing things down and critiquing. And I mean, for good reason, right? I think it's fair to say that our food and agricultural systems right now are really uncertain. The future is uncertain, and there's a lot to point to that is wrong. But perhaps we could use some of our intellectual energy to identify the points of resilience and resistance to these challenges. So that's where I wanted to turn next. And I asked folks to think about that a little bit and maybe to articulate how they're defining resilient as well. Does anybody want to go first?
Okay.
So I suggested this topic of resilience, and then I didn't come ready with a definition, so that was silly. But I think about resilience as the ability to weather shocks, right? That come, and ideally, ideally, we don't have as many shocks, so we have to be less resilient, right? But resilience is in the face of challenges that are outside of our control, which we know many are. How do we weather those? And that doesn't mean that things will always look the same, right? That we come back, we saw this in COVID, right? It doesn't mean we come back that everything looks the same as it did before. Like, we have changed, things have changed, right? And that's going to happen with all of these kind of transformations. But resilience is about, having that ability to weather that. And I think that involves, we've heard a lot so far about some like mutual aid, it involves looking to each other and thinking about, so governance is like a major thing that I think is important when we think about the food system and important to resilience. And there's actually, there's this kind of dichotomy in the food systems kind of discussion where there's some organizations and people and universities, institutions that are really focused on how do we just produce more food. And there's also research that suggests that we have enough food to feed everybody, and the issue is distribution. And the distribution is really about governance. It's also about economic systems, but economic and political systems, right, go together, right? They're connected. So just because something is market-based, and I'm not here to debate capitalism, we can do that later, but like, just because something is market-based doesn't necessarily we can have different political systems and different regulatory systems that go along with that create very different distributions, still with the presence of markets, right? And so that thinking about what are the governance, what are the governance breakdowns, what are the different forms of governance? I've been involved at various times in my life with the cooperative businesses, and cooperatives are owned by workers or users. Administrative challenges, connecting to something that Piper shared, is that a lot of states don't have, there's bureaucratic challenges, right? A lot of states in the U.S. actually don't have laws that allow for you to easily incorporate as a cooperative, right? And there's a lot of work that you have to do because you're doing something that's kind of outside the norm, you're coloring outside the lines in terms of a business model. But cooperatives allow for a more democratically an operated model to addresses some of the concerns that I think a lot of us are seeing right now about the anti-democratic kind of trends that we're seeing in terms of governance, and also that we're seeing in business, right, where we have this real kind of centralizing of control. So on governance, right, we have these, we can, to these solutions like cooperatives, we can look to policy changes that make alternatives easier. There's some really interesting research that looks at, developing, having urban farms in Kansas City and all of the permitting, right? Like changing our permitting processes, right, to allow different ways for food systems and food for farms to show up, right? To be allowed to grow food in different places and in different ways in our cities and our towns, right? That's another kind of piece of this, and Peter will probably share more about because he knows about it. Another thing that I think is important is, as Kate said, we could argue a lot. One of the things we argue about is climate change. And we argue about, how much exactly will the temperature rise, and who exactly will be impacted and what. I think we waste a lot of time arguing about precisely what's going to happen when we know that there's challenges coming, and we could be focusing a lot more time on solutions. And so a lot of it is, again, this is a governance problem. There's knowledge that we've built across the world about climate change, and it's a matter of implementing solutions. Example of something that I think that's really cool that's working. A friend of mine works for Washington State University, and her job is to take farmers from Washington State elsewhere and bring them to places that look like their future climate, which is so cool. Because again, like what I was saying, right, you need to adapt to the climate. Well, what's the best way to do that? You go talk to people who are in a climate like Washington's going to look like California. Great. Take Washington farmers, take them to California and say, this is your climate. this is going to be your climate in 20 years. How are you going to prepare your farm for this? What can you learn from these farmers to start adapting and you know, so it's not an academic talking to a farmer, it's an academic facilitating farmers talking to one another, which is a much more effective means of communication, I think, is that peer-to-peer learning. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think that I was talking about this in class today a little bit right before this. We get really stuck in various kinds of camps in the food system conversation around, you know, types of, you know, local food systems or organic food systems or all, you know, various kinds of labels. And I think that in doing so, we can use some of kind of the synergies across systems. Like, can we do some of these regenerative organic things scale, right? Like, is it that, you know, like it's instead of small organic, can we think regional, you know, like combinations that we're not thinking of because we have these very kind of polarized conversations happening in the food system. And I think that the polarization in the conversations hurt us because we end up talking past each other and we end up arguing with each other when I think everybody actually has a lot of the same goals. And so I think that requires something of us, which is to, you know, try to hear in what others are saying, even if it doesn't sound on its face like, oh, I agree with you, try to hear where those synergies are to be able to find the common ground to then move forward. There.
All right, on the topic of resilience, from like an ecological perspective, we kind of think about it in terms of resistance and resilience. And so this is resistance being like, how is a system going to resist a state change due to a disturbance or a perturbation? Resilience is whether or not that system that was moved out of that state can bounce back. So it's very similar, but just kind of thinking about it in that context, and that can happen really, you know, in one season in an annual cropping system, and we think about this, you know, particularly in the context of climate change. You know, as Zoe was touching on, climate change is going to do a lot of things that we can hypothesize about and theorize about. So one of the questions that came up from Zoom, which of the staple crops is really going to be affected or is already affected. Many of the C3 photosynthesizing plants will be affected by climate change, and that's because they essentially have to keep. So these are 85% of plants on Earth, and the vast majority of our crops. So. That sounds kind of scary. Yeah, it's kind of scary. But hear me out. So it's scary because in a warming climate, as that plant needs to open up its stomata to get CO2, it's going to be losing a lot more water due to transpiration because the climate is warmer. So it's just essentially going to kickstart that process. C4 plants, which corn and teff and amaranth, you know, so it's a very small window of crops, has a mechanism whereby it's able to essentially store CO2 inside its cells without having to open up its stomata if, for instance, it's too hot. Now, we also have the wonderful benefit of CO2 increasing in the atmosphere, so that may offset some of the issues that, say, like wheat or rice are facing as a result of heat. But largely speaking, like, where do we find opportunities to build resistance and build resilience so that in case we come to these situations where plants are stressed, the system itself is already built to be able to withstand some of that? So that's really where you start to think about resistance and resilience in the context of, like, we don't really want to see, like, you know, how we'll perform once we end up there. We want to worry about how we get there first. And so that's really building up the resilience of the system by, for instance, implementing some of these agroecological practices or regenerative or whatever framework you're pulling from that essentially is using the same kinds of practices to bring into your system. In terms of yields, and whether, where we're going in terms of that, there's projections that yields are going to be severely impacted by climate change. But as Zoe mentioned, we already produce enough food to feed the world. So a lot of the questions that I face, especially in a place like California, where we have some of the highest yields, and so that's the amount of food produced per piece of land, right? So your efficiency, so to speak, excluding the negative externalities that are created by, for instance, all these fertilizers and whatnot. My question always is how much is enough? Like, we already produce so much freaking food. Like, why do we need to produce more? And so some of the questions with regards to resistance and resilience is yield stability. And so it's a question of, like, during an adverse climate or weather year, or you have a period where the climate, like in California from 2000 to 2022, we had the worst mega drought in the last 1,200 years in the southwestern United States, which included much of California, including the Central Valley. So how are you able to withstand that? And so the ways that we're measuring it is yield stability. Do your yields go really high in good years and then crash in bad years, or do they kind of stay pretty steady across? And so it's really about building that resistance and resilience into the system before those things happen.
So thank you. I like what you both are saying. It's the issue of distribution is definitely really dear to my heart. I think I grew up in an urban environment, and so there's just no way that we're ever going to grow all the food we're going to eat living there. And resilience, I really dream of where the distribution is going, where it should. And I think in Whatcom County, in a place that is especially privileged in terms of distribution. Whatcom County, let me know if I'm making this up, but I believe it's one of the only counties in Washington that would be able to subsist itself on its local producers if it was totally cut off from the rest of the state. And so we have a really privileged system in terms of local food. And so it can be pretty easy to get up on about, why isn't anyone else doing this? But definitely living, I've gotten to see a lot of really good examples of resilience on a campus level. Farm, despite its funding being threatened every year, it persists, it gets that funding. Students stand up and let them know that this is a space that they really care for. People care about spending time together. So many programs that are designed to address the issue of affordability and to bridge that gap between the distribution on this local level to the students. So the Basic Needs Hub is a really excellent resource. They are connected to City Sprouts, which is the other campus farm. They are which is our food desert in Bellingham. They work with the Birchwood Food Desert Fires, which is a really good example of community resilience. There was an Albertsons there so many years ago, and when the Albertsons closed, they put a non-compete on the land. So basically no grocery stores could be open in the neighborhood of Birchwood for the next 70 years or something like that. And so they just using policy, they created a food desert in the neighborhood of Birchwood. So there's a lot of work going on there. They've created community food boxes, community fridges to make sure that people in the Birchwood neighborhood are able to access food. And City Sprouts does a lot of work with them. At the Outback Farm, is a mutual aid-based model that serves the food pantries on campus. There are probably way more food pantries on campus than you're aware of. There's the Whole Food Pantry in the Viking Union. There's also one at Fairhaven. There's also one at Miller. And there's a list of food pantries on the Basic Needs Hub website. Just yesterday, the Basic Needs Hub provided DSHS services, so for students to get signed up for SNAP benefits. So when those benefits are available, people can access them. There's Sustainable Connections, which has has a fridge, which is like a community fridge. So just during my time in Bellingham, I've seen so many examples of resilience. There are so many nonprofits, on-campus groups, community affinity groups that are doing this work to make sure that people aren't going hungry in their communities. And once again, I think we're coming from a place of real privilege that people care and that the food is here already. But it's, I think, when facing these global issues, to know that there are people in your community looking out for each other and attempting to address these issues. And I also know a lot of people are just kind of saying, screw it to bureaucracy and doing it themselves. Instead of forming a nonprofit, they're just cooking meals for each other and distributing them to people downtown. So if you're feeling motivated and frustrated that it's going to take a million steps, you can always do it the anarchist way. And yeah, I've seen just so many examples of resilience on campus. There are people who teach cooking classes. There's, Fairhaven especially, I think, is a place where a lot of work is going on to get food to people. And when we have a little time at the end, I have a bunch of events and volunteer opportunities that I can plug for everyone.
Sadly, I think we are getting to the end. We have time for one question. I'm so sorry, but they were saying such great things. I didn't want to cut anyone off. Yes.
In terms of agricultural agro ecosystem, those solutions for farming practices in our current state, would it be better to stay sort of globally isolated so we can focus inward? And would it be easier to continue to reach out globally to other countries as far as like creating a better food system?
Let's see if I can repeat the question. In terms of agroecological systems, is it better to sort of turn inwards, maintain our own systems, or continue to have a globalized food system? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Okay. Sounds like a people.
I think in order to facilitate agroecological transitions to then get to like a larger transformation, I think it would be more of an inward look. And I think it would have to come with some serious changes to the political economy. And I think that that's just something that we're never going to quite get around. And so that could look like agrarian land reform, for instance, or at least parts of it where like the government is going to like redistribute land. Like Bill Gates is the largest landowner in the United States, and like why does Bill Gates need to have hundreds of thousands of acres of land? There are great people who could go and farm that land. I don't necessarily think it would be a bad thing to be open to the world. I think that that's a great way to exchange ideas and whatnot. But I think if we're going to kind of bring in some of these agroecological transitions to get to that end goal of really creating these localized, stable, resistant, resilient food systems, it really has to start there, and probably even at the small scale with some of the work that Piper's doing, some of the work I was part of in West Sacramento with the urban farm through these mutual aid networks. I think are really where a lot of that is going to probably start. And I'd love to see it happen, you know, at the governmental level. And, you know, that could be like Zoe mentioned earlier. I think you were talking about changing zoning in cities to facilitate like opening up public land, or even creating some kind of deal with a private landowner to say like this person can farm that land, but the owner gets a tax break on it. Maybe you charge that owner that it would to essentially be zoned as agricultural land. So you pay like almost no taxes on that property, but you kind of facilitate that happening. And I think especially in the urban farm space, we need long-term leases. So we were in a piece of land in West Sacramento that was on a 5-year lease, and we were supposed to we're supposed to essentially be guaranteed that with the knowledge that a Native American museum was going to be built there, and we knew this for a long time. Last year, they pulled that agreement 3 years early, and we had to vacate. And luckily, we to another location in the city of Sacramento because we had built up a great relationship with a city council member who gave us 2 to 3 acres in a park that they're restoring. But those are some of the issues that I think are going to hamper these grassroots movements that can lead to some of these larger, quite frankly, socialist movements that could happen at the governmental level.
Can I quickly? Okay. At the risk of sounding like the evil economist, I want to just add that I think that there's real value in being interconnected globally. If you drink coffee, then you have to not drink coffee if we were not interconnected globally. Hawaii is the only state that produces any coffee, and it's not enough for all of us. And so I think that we need to think about smart things like Europe has a carbon adjustment tax, for example, which is like incentivizing the folks that export to European countries to then produce things in ways that have lower emissions, right? So there are policy ways that you can have an international trade system that I think is addresses some of the concerns that people have, and that I think can go alongside a lot of the amazing work that Peter's describing.
Okay, I know we're out of time, so give us just a second because I know that Piper wants to share a couple of events coming up, and I will also send these out in an email. So if you want to just give a quick plug.
This Saturday at 2:30 in the Fairhaven College Auditorium is the Mutual Aid Convivial. So if you're interested in mutual aid, free lunch. It will be at 2:30 this Saturday in the Fairhaven Auditorium. This information is on the Fairhaven College Instagram. Next Friday, there will be a farm to sum up the work that my class, Outback Farm and Food Justice, has been doing. So be a free lunch at 3:00 next Friday. That information will also be coming up on Fairhaven College. If anyone is looking for a term opportunity to build resilience and build practical skills, there is this thing at Fairhaven called the Preservation Station, which is a project determined to preserve the abundance that's produced on the farm during its most productive season and provide food to students in the fall and winter. So if you're looking for a volunteer opportunity, the Preservation Station is a really cool way that they're building resilience on that. So yeah, this Saturday, next Friday, to the future, get connected with Fairhaven and Outback Farm.
Can I say one more thing? I'm also going to make an announcement for the Ferndale First Fruits Garden. If you have a way to get to that garden, Kate can probably share my email with everybody, but if you'd like to come and volunteer, I do offer it as a pretty full-fledged informal learning experience whereby you can kind of choose what you want in terms of learning about agroecological practices, food system stuff. The kind of model that we had in West Sacramento was we would basically learn as we work. So I talk through what we're doing, why we're doing it, how it impacts the ecosystem, how it may impact neighboring ecosystems, and then I dedicate 20 to 30 minutes in the middle of the workday to a discussion, and that's topic specific, and I invite others to come in also lead and facilitate those. So if you'd like to get more involved in some of these agroecological transformations that are happening in a tenth of an acre, come and join.
And I'll plug for Zoe that she teaches some great classes that I'm sure many of you would like. Okay, please help me thank Piper, Peter, and Zoe. Thank you all. See you next week.